A man too early in the service of his country to avoid making a multiplicity of enemies, too honest, upright, faithful, and intrepid to be popular, too often obliged by his principles and feelings to oppose Machiavellian intrigues to avoid the destiny he suffered. This man never had justice done him by his country in his lifetime, and I fear he never will by posterity. Such is how John Adams described Arthur Lee, the youngest son of Thomas Lee, and one of the men most responsible for America's independence, who is now almost forgotten. For it was, as Adams wrote, Arthur was the most intelligent of the Lees, a fierce patriot, a skilled diplomat, but also caustic, acerbic, and suspicious, and so his immense accomplishments have been all but forgotten. Posterity, after all, has long preferred to gaze upon the statuesque portraits of the founding generation's most famous members, the demigod-like presence of George Washington, the elegant prose of Thomas Jefferson, and the philosophical serenity of faux frontiersman and gentleman scientist Benjamin Franklin at the court of Versailles. It was behind the scenes of all this that Arthur Lee played his great part, serving as the integral figure in a war of clandestine ledger books, false identities, maritime shipments, and espionage. Within this arena, no single figure performed a more vital, indispensable service to the nascent republic than did Dr. Arthur Lee of Stratford Hall. Of all the brilliant and volatile sons born to Thomas Lee and Hannah Ludwell Lee within the thick brick walls of Westmoreland County's Stratford Hall, Arthur was indisputably the most intellectually gifted and the most thoroughly exasperating. He was a polymath who straddled the fascinating worlds of European science, British common law, and international diplomacy, securing the very weapons and powder that allowed the Continental Army to survive the critical campaigns of 1777. He served as America's first secret diplomatic agent, tracking the movements of the British and negotiating the supply lines that culminated in the pivotal American victory at Saratoga. Yet, despite these achievements, Arthur Lee's public career concluded not with accolades or domestic honors, but in a cloud of bitter recrimination, formal recall from France, and political isolation. Why? Why did this great man, who possessed a doctorate of medicine with high honors, an advanced degree in the common law from the Middle Temple, a fellowship in the Royal Society, and the deep respect of the early revolutionaries, become the most thoroughly alienated and vilified figure in early American diplomacy? Because he couldn't help but sow discord. As his biographer, Louis Potts, notes in the book Arthur Lee, Virtuous Revolutionary, quote, "Whether aboard the Alliance or on diplomatic assignment in Europe, dissension and disruption swirled around Arthur Lee. Wherever he traveled, storm clouds gathered." End quote. Indeed, such is what we'll discuss. In this episode, we're going to trace the extraordinary and tragic arc of Arthur Lee's career. We will observe his transformation from an elite expatriate scholar in London to a fierce, radical pamphleteer who challenged the authority of Parliament under its very nose. We will follow his cloak and dagger operations across the continent, from the back rooms of London taverns, where he designed dummy corporations with French secret agents, to the highways of Spain and the hostile courts of Berlin. We will chart his disastrous, catastrophic collision with Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane within the American legation at Passy, an internal war that paralyzed American foreign policy and divided the Continental Congress into bitter, feuding factions. Finally, we will contemplate his lonely, eccentric life in the Virginia countryside after the Revolution and observe how the opening of European archives a century after his death, British archives in particular, provided a total vindication of his most controversial suspicions about the corruption that existed right under Benjamin Franklin's nose. The separation of Arthur Lee from his family's estates in the northern neck of Virginia occurred at a remarkably early age. Born in December of 1740, he was the youngest of the surviving sons of Thomas Lee of Stratford Hall, as we covered in our episode on the Lee brothers. Following the death of his father in 1750, the implementation of primogeniture left the boy financially dependent upon the calculations of his eldest brother, the very dominating Philip Ludwell Lee, who sent the boy across the Atlantic for his finishing. And so, in 1755, at the age of 14, Arthur stepped aboard a merchant vessel to exit the Potomac, and he was destined for the elite cloisters of Eton College in England, where his father, Thomas, had sent Philip to be educated. At Eton, Arthur was thoroughly broken to the language and the discipline of the British aristocracy, particularly in regards to the classics. He spent his adolescence immersed in the translation of Greek and Latin texts, mastering a style of classical rhetoric that was designed to command the assemblies of the empire. Describing this period of Arthur Lee's life and how the training in the classics he received at Eton shaped his stern Republican morality, Potts notes, quote, "The education offered by Eton largely consisted of endless hours of recitation and composition in Greek and Latin. Classical study was thought to be a valuable source of moral lessons to inspire manliness, patriotism, and love of liberty. No less an oracle than John Locke had decreed that Latin was absolutely necessary to be a gentleman, and Greek as necessary to a scholar. Because Arthur aimed at both goals, he doggedly grappled with both tongues. The recitations Arthur Lee endured at Eton engraved countless quotations and numerous maxims from the history of Greece and Rome upon his memory. This training gave a moralistic and pedantic cast to many of his later publications. The past for him was a storehouse not of mere illustrations, but of authoritative precedents." End quote. Further, describing why this was and how the classics that he studied shaped the anti-Hanoverian, pro-independence views not just of Lee, but of others like him, such as his classically trained and beloved brother, Richard Henry Lee, whose incredible life we covered in a previous episode. Potts notes, quote, "The heritage of classical antiquity from which Lee and other Americans drew was predominantly the political history of Republican Rome from the 1st century BC to the end of the 2nd century AD. The shared focus was on the moral and political decline of the Roman Republic. Writers such as Plutarch, Livy, Cicero, Tacitus, and Sallust were most favored. From these tracts, the colonists envisioned a heroic age filled with virtue, simplicity, patriotism, integrity, justice, and liberty that had fallen victim to venal, cynical, and oppressive rulers. To erudite colonials, there is no more graphic analogy to explain Augustan Britain. Republican Rome had grown rich, luxurious, corrupt, and licentious, only to fall prey to the Goths, who had retained their primitive virtues. Such an interpretation did not bode well for the British Empire under the Hanoverians." And of all the authors of the classical world that Arthur Lee studied at Eton, by far the most impactful upon him was Sallust. Potts notes, quote, "Particularly pertinent to Arthur Lee were the histories of Sallust. These moralistic compositions repeated the theme that power, ambition, and avarice had caused the erosion of Roman character and collapse of the Roman Republic. Such observations seemed validated by Arthur's own experience. To Sallust, as to the student from Virginia, an individual's virtue was the keystone to Republican society. Throughout his life, Lee maintained a stance of stern integrity modeled on Sallust's portraits of the selfless aristocrats of Republican Rome. Virtue was Lee's primary moral precept and the ultimate goal of his aspirations. Thus, to a large extent, reading the classics, rather than parental guidance, determined his code of behavior. The lessons Arthur learned as a schoolboy from Sallust were those he later broadcast in his pamphlets and letters." End quote. Then, in 1761, he began his study of medicine at the University of Edinburgh, entering what was then one of the best medical schools in the world. He supplemented these studies with a period of study at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, mastering the analytical methodologies that were restructuring the natural sciences, such as what he was studying during the Enlightenment. While he excelled at Edinburgh, Lee didn't like it there. There are very few fellow Americans. He couldn't stand the Scots. He actually has a lot of letters from that period that are just full of anti-Scottish sentiment, which was quite fashionable in London at the time. And in any case, Arthur's inclinations were not toward medicine. That was a career foisted upon him by his brother Philip, who wanted him to earn some money so he could get off the family payroll. Nevertheless, Arthur made a success of this career and course of study he didn't like, and in 1765 he graduated from Edinburgh with high honors, receiving his doctorate of medicine after presenting a sophisticated treatise written in Latin on the botanical properties and healing properties of Peruvian bark, a remedy for malaria. This treatise was so excellent, actually, that it eventually got him into the Royal Society with the help of his future enemy, noted American gentleman scientist Benjamin Franklin. So in 1766, Dr. Arthur Lee returned to Virginia to begin work. He had, up until this point, not received the money his father left him in the estate, as Philip refused to distribute it until all debts on Thomas's estate were paid, and had been living on gifts from Philip and Richard Henry. Arthur established a medical practice within the colonial capital of Williamsburg, hanging his shingle along the dusty reach of the Duke of Gloucester Street. But the transition from the vibrant intellectual centers of Edinburgh and London to the parochial atmosphere of Virginia's provincial capital, a small town at best, was a source of immense frustration for the young physician. Describing Arthur over this period, Potts notes, quote, "A notice in the Virginia Gazette of July 4th, 1766, announced the arrival of Dr. Arthur Lee at Williamsburg. The youthful physician, not yet 26 years of age, had returned to his native colony after spending half of his lifetime in British schools. As the scholarly and intense scion of the Stratford Lees, veteran of the Continental Tour, companion to Samuel Johnson, Adam Smith, and the Earl of Shelburne, Arthur doubtless appeared out of place at the provincial capital. Tall and direct, he could match any Virginian in excellence and grace, perhaps to the point of being overbearing. His defiantly poised yet delicately oval face, brooding blue eyes, large nose, and pointed chin reflected his mother. Perhaps his hair was blonde or reddish-hued like Richard Henry's. This well-schooled gentleman had arrived to establish his profession as provincial physician." End quote. Lee found himself bored by the routine of colonial medicine, which consisted largely of bleeding sick planters and treating the chronic fevers that plagued the low-lying tidewater plantations. His study of Peruvian bark had come in quite useful, after all, but that usefulness wasn't enough. As Potts puts it, quote, "Arthur did not last long as a doctor, nor did Williamsburg contain him. He was still searching for his calling. It might have been the competition or the provincial aspects of the town. He later reflected, perseverance, of which I have very little, is absolutely requisite for a physician." End quote. Boredom turned to danger when, in 1766, fresh off the boat back from England, Arthur Lee challenged either James or George Mercer, the details are somewhat unclear, to a duel over allegations the Mercer family made regarding Richard Henry Lee's character and the Stamp Act, a situation we covered a little bit in our episode on that political crisis. Richard Henry had led an effigy burning of Mercer, who had briefly agreed to be the stamp agent. Tensions were high. Richard Henry Lee was exposed as having temporarily requested becoming a stamp agent before later turning on Mercer. It was an explosive situation, and Arthur bravely stood by his brother, Richard Henry, who he loved throughout life. But Mercer was a celebrated fighter of the sort one would expect from a Cavalier society. Arthur, basically raised in a cosmopolitan setting, knew nothing about dueling with swords or pistols, and so George Washington apparently intervened with the Mercer family to save Arthur's life, and the situation fizzled out while reflecting well enough on the honor of both men, and it went away with Arthur not having been killed in a duel. In any case, Arthur was done with Williamsburg within a few years, and in 1768, he abandoned his Williamsburg practice and crossed the Atlantic for a second time, fully determined to reinvent himself as a barrister. He secured admission to Lincoln's Inn and subsequently to the Middle Temple in London, beginning his studies for a second professional degree in 1770. This wasn't daunting to him, for Arthur Lee loved it in London and achieved a remarkable degree of social and intellectual elevation within this thriving British metropolis. His scientific credentials secured him election as a Fellow of the Royal Society, as we mentioned a minute ago, a prestigious honor that placed him on intimate terms with leading minds of the era. So he became a regular companion of literary giants like James Boswell, whom he had become fast friends with at Edinburgh, and the formidable Dr. Samuel Johnson, frequently dining and trading sharp, witty observations at the hospitable table of John Paradise, a London scholar who had woven himself into the Virginia gentry by marrying a daughter of the prominent Ludwell line. Potts, describing this period in Arthur Lee's life, notes, quote, "In the spring of 1770, he conceded that neither his disposition nor his interests were compatible with the life of a physician. Following the advice of his distant cousin, Edmund Jennings, he enrolled as a student at Lincoln's Inn on March 1st, 1770, in the hope that the study of law would prove more honorable and profitable than medicine. Undaunted by the prospect of 5 more years of schooling, Arthur believed he could gain a law degree if he bridled his energy and, quote, unless I shall be diverted by something very tempting or discouraging, end the internal quote. In fact, academic regulations were lax, the inn's real value being their libraries, their proximity to Westminster, and their intellectual atmosphere. Lee followed an independent course of study that enabled him to maintain interest in cultural events and political currents in London. He frequented the weekly meetings of the Royal Society, was named a member of the Society of Arts and Agriculture, and subscribed to Bach's and Abel's concerts. Lee thrived amidst such manifestations of high culture, end quote. But as the imperial crisis between Great Britain and her American colonies deepened into open hostility, Lee's focus on his studies turned increasingly into a focus on politics. In fact, Lee's classical Republican training reasserted itself with a fierce, militant intensity. He recognized that the colonies required an active, sophisticated defender within the capital of the enemy, and so he weaponized his pen to mount what was really a scorched earth propaganda war in the London press, building on his talents as a writer that had been earlier expressed in the 10 letters he wrote for the Virginia Gazette in opposition to the Townshend Acts under the pseudonym Monitor. In London, emulating the famous British political critic Junius, Arthur adopted the pen name Junius Americanus. Over the course of several years, he published a sequence of searing analytical essays that blasted the policies of the ministry, exposing what he saw as the constitutional illegality of parliamentary taxation on the colonies and defending the liberties of the American assemblies. Meanwhile, his fiery Monitor's letters from shortly beforehand were being reprinted extensively across the Atlantic, and so his calls for the fragmented colonies to form a unified front against British tyranny echoed across the Atlantic world. He was becoming famous as a writer, though using pseudonyms and being anonymous as he wrote. Potts, describing this contradictory period in Arthur's life, one in which he thrived in the swirl of Georgian society in London, while also becoming the leading revolutionary writer, notes, quote, by 1770, Arthur Lee was in the vanguard of American radicalism. During his brief stay in Virginia, he had readily adopted the rhetoric of resistance. In his personal correspondence and in the Monitor series, he often exceeded Delaney, Dickinson, and other pamphleteers in insistence on American dominion over all forms of taxation, in reliance upon a united stand by all the colonies, and in faith in petitions and other constitutional mechanisms of redress. His frequent calls for virtue, selflessness, and his alarms concerning liberties, self-determination, had already suggested independence and the possibility of war within the British Empire to him. Yet he had no lust for separation. Instead, he once again traveled to England to establish himself close to the center of London radicalism and within the opposition. Those American patriots who were informed on English politics in the explosive era of 1768 to 1776 came to rely on the analyses and prognoses offered in Lee's voluminous writings. Despite his academic training and in-depth reading, Lee was more emotional than his fellow pamphleteers. He combined rational argument with non-rational perceptions and at the same time confronted his own personal anxieties and conscious fears. Although he did not fully realize it, Arthur Lee was to play a pivotal role in history. End quote. Arthur Lee had become a radical, if also very genteel, ideologue operating within the heart of the British Empire. The gathering of the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia during the tumultuous spring of 1775 forced the creation of new underground state institutions. In November of that year, recognizing that the Continental Army under General Washington was locked in an unequal conflict without a reliable source of gunpowder or arms, Congress organized the Committee of Secret Correspondence. The primary, urgent task of this committee was to locate foreign sources of supply and secure clandestine assistance from European rivals who wished to see the power of Great Britain broken, so namely France and Spain. Because of his extensive connections, his legal training, and his proven radicalism as a famous writer, the committee looked across the Atlantic to Arthur Lee, who was trusted for the position in part because he was already an ally of Samuel Adams, and he was the Massachusetts correspondent to Britain and France. Lee thus became the secret diplomatic agent for the Patriot cause in Europe, an appointment that transformed this barrister in London into America's first international spy. Operating despite constant surveillance, British government informants, and post office mail interceptors, Lee managed to score dramatic coups for the Patriot cause. It was during this period of his life in London that Lee was introduced to Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, the celebrated French polymath, creator of the Barber of Seville, and a high-level secret operative for the court of King Louis XVI. Beaumarchais had been dispatched to London by the French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, to monitor the stability of the British government and determine whether the American rebellion possessed the fortitude and seriousness to warrant French intervention. So, utilizing his training as a lawyer, a diplomat, classical-minded scholar, gentleman about town, Lee successfully convinced Beaumarchais that the American cause was no transient provincial riot, but rather the beginning of a permanent separation. He argued that if France chose to secretly arm the colonies, they could deal a devastating blow to the British Empire without incurring the risk of an open declaration of war. Beaumarchais was convinced, and so he and Lee set about making it a reality, even after Lee fled from London to France to avoid the agents of the Crown. To mask the transaction from British intelligence, they created a dummy commercial corporation named Rodriguez, Hortelez and Company. This non-existent merchant house was funded by a secret subsidy of 1 million livres from the Royal Treasury of France, a sum that was soon duplicated by a parallel grant of 1 million livres from the court of Spain. The corporation used this capital to purchase quantities of muskets, cannon, tents, and gunpowder directly from Royal French arsenals, loading the material onto large merchant vessels that cleared European ports under false cargo manifests. Over the course of late 1776 and early 1777, the ships of Rodriguez, Hortelez and Company successfully crossed the Atlantic, discharging their cargoes into the ports of Portsmouth and Boston, and this network, the secret network that Arthur Lee had helped construct, supplied more than 80% of the total ordnance and military equipment utilized by the Continental forces during the Northern Campaign. It was these French muskets, Spanish gunpowder, and the like that armed the American lines under General Horatio Gates, providing the material necessary to halt the advance and then defeat General John Burgoyne, winning the pivotal Battle of Saratoga. Describing this period of Arthur Lee's life in his book, The 9 Lives of Arthur Lee, Virginia Patriot, author A.R. Riggs notes, quote, "At the hazard of his life, Lee was the last official colonial agent and the first American spy to operate in London. In that capacity, he made the contacts with the government of France that brought secret aid for the American army at Saratoga, New York, and resulted in the victorious Franco-American alliance." End quote. As he secretly negotiated with the French, Arthur was financially supported by the Lee family. I remember the Lee brothers always acted in concert, and that's part of what made them so effective, as we covered in our episode on the Lee brothers. And it was actually a single shipment of tobacco from Stratford Hall that indirectly saved the American Revolution. Casanova Gardner Lee notes this in the book Lee Chronicle, describing Lee's secret negotiations and secret communications and how that played into keeping the revolution alive and providing it with the material he needed. Lee notes, quote, "He was using only the most guarded language in those days, as he had no wish to become a guest of the king in the Tower of London. The 200 guineas from the sale of this tobacco, as a side note, which had been shipped to him by Richard Henry Lee and handled by Lee family agent William Lee," back to the quote, "supported Arthur Lee during those trying months when he was negotiating with Beaumarchais for funds from France. This money from the French government loaded 3 ships with the arms and ammunition, which won for us the Battle of Saratoga. The shipment of tobacco from Stratford was a good investment." End quote. Arthur Lee had engineered a diplomatic masterpiece in the shadows, but his very success was about to draw him into a toxic, visible arena where his stern moral rectitude and penchant for feuding with those whose motives he distrusted, which is to say pretty much everyone other than Samuel Adams and his brothers, would become his undoing. In the late months of 1776, seeking to formalize and expand its international presence, the Continental Congress passed a resolution appointing a three-man commission to represent the United States at the court of France. They selected Benjamin Franklin, the venerable philosopher of Philadelphia, Silas Deane, a prosperous merchant from Connecticut, and Dr. Arthur Lee, the Patriot radical. Arthur exited London in secret, traveling across the Channel to join his colleagues in Paris and France. He arrived expecting to find a disciplined, methodically organized legation operating with the virtue of a Republican assembly. Instead, he found a loose, chaotic style, and it shocked him. Lee, during this period, became a fierce advocate for what historians call militia diplomacy. This was his belief that a young republic like America should bypass the slow, deceptive, aristocratic protocols of traditional European courts, avoiding the wastage of all-important time that came with engaging in polite salon flirtations or waiting for royal preferment. Instead, this lifetime radical Arthur Lee believed America's diplomats should present themselves directly to the ministries of Europe and demand immediate recognition and open alliances. So when Franklin and Deane counseled patience and indirect maneuver, Lee grew increasingly suspicious and viewed their hesitation as a sign of weakness or, worse, a compromise of public integrity. And he wasn't slow to accuse them of such. Seeking to break the diplomatic logjam in Paris, which wasn't quite ready to recognize America, Lee decided to undertake a hazardous solo mission to Spain in the early months of 1777. The stakes of this were immense. An open official appearance by an American commissioner in Madrid could force the Spanish government into an immediate confrontation with Great Britain, which would be a major problem as it would trigger a premature declaration of war. And this was an issue as the British fleets still largely ruled the seas and the Spanish silver fleets were traveling across them. So upon word of his travels and intentions, the Spanish ministry sent urgent dispatches commanding Lee to halt before he reached the capital. This he eventually did, and Lee met with Spanish representatives of the crown around the towns of Burgos and Vitoria. Standing within the damp stone rooms of rural Spanish post houses, the tenacious and spirited Arthur Lee negotiated directly with the powerful Spanish minister, the Marquess de Grimaldi, explaining to him the commercial advantages that would accrue to the House of Bourbon if the British monopoly over American tobacco and timber were permanently broken, while also calling for the provision of Spanish aid. These arguments eventually bore some fruit. While Grimaldi refused to grant him entry to Madrid, he did successfully secure a covert loan of around 300,000 livres for the American cause and helped organize a supply pipeline for the Patriots through the merchant houses of Bilbao and Cadiz, sending huge cargoes of tents, blankets, shoes, all of which were immensely needed to the Continental Army. These supplies were to prove instrumental in American victory. So, flush with this success, Lee turned his eyes towards the Baltic and traveled to Berlin in the summer of 1777 in an attempt to court the favor of Frederick the Great of Prussia, who hated the British, particularly King George III, because of how they had betrayed him at the end of the 7 Years' War, which almost led to the destruction of Prussia. He entered a Prussian capital that was teeming with espionage. Its streets were patrolled by British intelligence operatives who were determined to prevent any formal treaty between Prussia and the United States. And it was here that Arthur Lee became the victim of a scene that seems straight out of an espionage novel. You see, the British envoy to Prussia, a clever and exceedingly unscrupulous diplomat named Hugh Elliot, recognized that Lee's private papers contained important details about American foreign policy. So to steal them, Elliot organized a very bold heist. He bribed a domestic servant at Lee's hotel, the Auberge de Corsica, to obtain duplicate keys to the commissioner's private chambers. While Lee was dining downstairs in the public room, Eliot's operatives entered the chamber, pried open his locked leather portfolio, and quickly carried his private journals and diplomatic correspondence to the British legation. For several hours, a team of British clerks worked under candlelight, copying every single secret dispatch, ledger line, description of the French and Spanish supply lines they could. But they didn't get back in time to return all the papers, and so Arthur Lee discovered it and raised verbal hellfire down on the British. The papers were eventually returned, but only after they'd been copied. Eliot was formally condemned by the British, but also got £1,000 as a reward because this was a huge coup for the British, and he was reassigned. So this was a major victory for the British. While Frederick the Great expressed utter outrage at Eliot's violation of diplomatic immunity and just general good behavior, the damage was immense and irreversible, and a Prussian alliance, in any case, eluded America. The incident confirmed Arthur Lee's deepest, most visceral instinct. The American cause was surrounded by a network of deception, one that had to be rooted out. Upon his return to France, Arthur Lee discovered that the power base of American diplomacy had shifted entirely away from his control. Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane had established the official headquarters of the American legation at Passy, a luxurious estate between Paris and Versailles that was provided to them by Leray de Chaumont, a wealthy French merchant speculator who possessed extensive private financial interests in the American trade. Lee was horrified by the luxurious, lackadaisical, and potentially corrupt atmosphere he found when he got back. For one, he was furious because he'd been frozen out. He became a permanent third wheel within his own commission. Franklin and Deane conducted private conferences, signed major commercial contracts, and managed millions of livres in French subsidies without ever consulting Lee or allowing him access to the ledger books. They even kept him from living with them. He had to live in a distant house and visit them if he wanted to participate in the diplomacy. That wasn't all. Lee also discovered corruption, finding a massive web of war profiteering and embezzlement involving Silas Deane, who was systematically violating the boundaries between his public diplomatic office and his private commercial ventures. Deane, Lee found, was using public shipping space to transport private merchant cargoes, charging the Continental Congress exorbitant, inflated commissions on the weapons procured through Rodriguez, Horteles and Company, and speculation networks to enrich himself and his merchant allies in New York and Connecticut. Lee fired off a barrage of angry, detailed dispatches to his brothers Richard Henry and Francis Lightfoot Lee in the Continental Congress and accused Deane of massive corruption. Worse was Lee's discovery of treason. Edward Bancroft, a prominent American naturalist who served as the confidential secretary to the legation and Franklin's closest personal assistant, had a habit of taking sudden weekend journeys to London. Meanwhile, the British ministry possessed what amounted to both immediate and exact knowledge of the commission's secret negotiations months before the dispatches reached Philadelphia. It knew everything from the routes of supply ships to the negotiating position of the fledgling American Republic. And Bancroft had been spotted meeting with British officials when he arrived in London for his many trips. Treason was obvious, and Lee explicitly accused Bancroft of being a paid informant for the British Secret Service, demanding his immediate expulsion from the legation gates. The result of all these accusations was a catastrophic collision with Benjamin Franklin. Franklin completely refused to entertain Lee's charges or even examine the evidence, and he viewed Lee as a disruptive, neurotic liability who was threatening to alienate the French court, just as all important military treaties were being finalized. Franklin defended Deane as a practical and indispensable man of commerce and treated the accusations against Bancroft with utter contempt, famously remarking that even if his secretary were a British spy, he would change nothing as he possessed no secrets he wished to hide from the king's ministers. Describing this period in the book Lee Chronicle, Casanova Gardner Lee notes, quote, Franklin's intimate friend and trusted confidant, who throughout the war was on the British payroll as a secret agent, and the almost unbelievable double dealings of Deane and others which went on right under Franklin's nose at the American diplomatic headquarters at Passy, outside of Paris. But when Arthur Lee laid these villainies before Dr. Franklin and warned him of the dangers to which he was exposed, he refused to believe them and denounced the Lees for their officiousness. Arthur was rewarded for his pains by what amounted to virtual exclusion from the proceedings of the mission, although he was an accredited member of the triumvirate of which Franklin and Dean were the other members. The Lees had their faults, but time has shown them to be honest, fearless, and suspicious of most men in Paris, and with good reason. Their unmasking of the group of men surrounding Franklin brought down upon their heads a torrent of vituperation from which neither Arthur nor William ever recovered. End quote. Exhausted and deeply infuriated by Lee's relentless, abrasive, and self-righteous behavior, Franklin sent him a letter declaring, quote, "I look upon you as a man of sick mind, forever tormenting itself with its own jealousies and suspicions, and which will inevitably end in absolute insanity if you do not master your temperament." End quote. But Lee could do no other. His classical training compelled him to rage against such corruption and perfidy. As author A.R. Riggs notes, quote, "Arthur Lee was suspicious, temperamental, and sometimes petulant, but jealousy was not one of his own faults. It is hard to understand how a man of integrity and real passion for a cause could have reacted differently toward Dean, Bancroft, and their supporters." End quote. This internal warfare soon spilled across the Atlantic, triggering a vicious civil war within the Continental Congress. The alignment of the Lee-Adams junto, spearheaded by Richard Henry Lee, who we discussed in a recent episode, and Samuel Adams, rallied fiercely to defend Arthur, viewing his crusade as a noble defense of Republican virtue. They faced the powerful opposition of the mercantile faction, led by Robert Morris and Silas Dean's allies, who mounted a campaign to vilify the Lee family as a pack of arrogant, disruptive obstructionists who were ruining the French alliance. This went on for a long time, but the results of it were disastrous for Lee, particularly as the French foreign minister, Vergennes, found Arthur Lee's attitude intolerable. Vergennes explicitly informed Franklin the French court would no longer transact business with Lee and threw his political weight behind the movement to remove him. Some authors note that Arthur Lee's accusations were getting dangerously close to exposing a great deal of corruption involving French officials, and that's why they reacted so harshly to him. In any case, by late 1779, facing total diplomatic paralysis and a fractured assembly, the Continental Congress formally voted to recall Arthur Lee from his post in Europe, bringing a bitter, humiliating conclusion to his secret war for independence. Describing this period and the attitude in Congress that led to Arthur Lee being castigated in 1779 for what had been treated as virtue by Congress in 1776, it's noted that through the frenzy of the Lee-Dean dispute, there were some who evaded intense politicization. William Churchill Houston, a new delegate from New Jersey who had not participated in the votes, but who had been intrigued by the inflammatory opinions expressed by his colleagues and in the newspapers, took a moderate stance. In subsequent debates, he appeared as a member of the ascendant Middle South coalition. He saw Arthur Lee as the epitome of old radicalism. "I take Mr. Arthur Lee to be a man of jealous, suspecting, difficult disposition, trusty, capable, and industrious, indefatigable above all others in procuring and transmitting intelligence, accurate and frugal in expenses and money matters, simple, severe, and republican in his manners, so much so as to be thought by many sour and inimical." End quote. The vote to dismiss Lee from the Foreign Service was interpreted as an effort to calm the turbulence in the diplomatic corps. Lee's talents and verve had been welcomed in 1776. In 1779, they were not only deemed inappropriate, but even castigated. So the homecoming of Dr. Arthur Lee in the late summer of 1780 was a somber, bitter exile. Indeed, it even began with unpleasantness as Arthur Lee departed France in 1780. The harbor of Lorient became the setting for what amounted to a coup involving the perpetually dyspeptic and always outspoken Arthur Lee. The Continental frigate Alliance sat at anchor, its crew reduced to a state of boiling insubordination because the French prize agent, Le Rey de Chaumont, had withheld their back wages and the substantial prize money secured from the legendary capture of the Serapis. while Benjamin Franklin had officially relieved the volatile French captain Pierre Landais from his post and given the spring command to Commodore John Paul Jones, Arthur Lee informed Landais that his original commission had been issued directly by the Continental Congress and that neither Franklin nor Jones possessed the constitutional authority to divest him of his vessel. Landais surreptitiously boarded the Alliance while Jones was absent in Paris, confined Jones's loyal officers beneath an armed guard, and successfully orchestrated a bloodless coup to reclaim the deck. When Jones returned bearing a French royal warrant to reclaim his command, Landais slipped down to Port Louis, threatening to open fire with his heavy cannons against the timber boom placed across the harbor mouth by the French port captain, and he eventually defiantly put to sea with Arthur Lee and several tons of Lee's private cargo, though not a coach that Lee wanted to bring back to America with him, safely on board. But this wasn't the end of it. Landais' eccentricities rapidly escalated into madness, culminating in an incident where the captain nearly stabbed a passenger with a carving knife over a serving of roast pig at the cabin table. The captain was also constantly feuding with Arthur Lee over Lee's complaints about the quality of food and water served. It was an issue. Terrified by their commander's erratic seamanship, the passengers and crew enacted a second mutiny, forcibly locking Landais within his state chamber and compelling First Lieutenant James Degg to assume command to guide the fractured, deeply divided frigate into the safety of Boston Harbor. When Arthur Lee finally arrived in Philadelphia, he found the city that was locked in inflation and exhaustion, a capital where his old merchant adversaries looked upon him with overt hostility. Lacking a residence of his own or the means to establish a legal practice in America, for he had really left everything behind when he left London to serve the American cause, Arthur retreated to the home of his beloved sister, Alice Lee Shippen. Within the walls of the Shippen house, he spent months licking his wounds, sorting through his extensive collection of dispatches, and drafting lengthy, furious public defenses to vindicate his character before an assembly that was focused on anything else. Yet, despite the controversy that clouded his name, Lee's world-class intellect and unyielding integrity remained objects of deep respect among the Patriot leadership, particularly not just in his home state of Virginia, but among the northern states. The state of Massachusetts, recognizing his early service as their colonial agent in London, passed a formal vote of appreciation, rewarding him with a substantial land grant of 6,000 acres in the western wilderness, and in 1781, Harvard University honored his scholarship by awarding him the honorary degree of Doctor of Laws, an accolade that offered some solace to his bruised patrician pride. Arthur eventually re-entered the political arena through the legislature of his native state of Virginia. The freeholders of Virginia elected him to the General Assembly, and in 1782 he was returned to Philadelphia as a delegate to the Confederation Congress, serving until 1785. In this capacity, Lee reasserted his classical Republican principles with a vengeance. Congress appointed him to serve on the powerful Federal Board of Treasury, a post that allowed him to apply his highly suspicious nature to oversight of the chaotic ledgers of the new nation. He audited contracts, slashed administrative waste, and relentlessly pursued any merchant speculator who attempted to overcharge the government, and so he got to operate as a fierce, incorruptible watchdog over public funds. But as the post-revolutionary order stabilized, culminating in the ratification of the Constitution, a document that Arthur fiercely opposed alongside his brother Richard Henry Lee for its lack of a Bill of Rights, a problem that Lee eventually solved, the old spy found himself increasingly out of tune with his times. Indeed, he was depressed by them, disillusioned by the rank corruption he saw growing around him, and threatening his dreams of a virtue-oriented republic. During this period, he remarked, quote, "It is most manifest that we do not have the public virtue and private temperaments which are necessary to the establishment, at least, of free republics," end quote. Further, much like his brother Richard Henry Lee, Arthur Lee, the old revolutionary, was growing more reactionary as he saw the ravages of the French Revolution and grew disgusted with what his countrymen were up to. Lewis Potts notes, quote, "He was an early commentator on the evolution of partisanship in federal politics, a booster of the developing national economy, a devotee of Washington's leadership, and an opponent of the stand on natural rights taken by Thomas Paine in the French Revolution. Lee grew more reactionary. Where before he had written that society was improving as citizens became enlightened, in 1790 he recorded, 'To me it appears very doubtful whether the increase of knowledge in this age has increased our happiness, either political or moral.' Further reflection brought him to observe, 'I am most sure that the people of America are much less happy than before the Revolution, and I believe it will soon be the same with the people of France.' He was ever the misfit." End quote. And so Arthur Lee retired completely from public service, retreating to a substantial estate named Lansdowne, situated along the low, quiet stretches of Middlesex County. He had actually grown reasonably wealthy in old age, despite the many incidents during his life. At Lansdowne, Arthur lived out his remaining years as a lonely, eccentric, and increasingly isolated bachelor. He tried marrying, but to no avail. Though he had friendships with women over his life, the caustic hero just couldn't convince any lady, young or old, to marry him. So he planted extensive orchards, corresponded with his favorite nieces, and attempted to manage his crops according to scientific principles. Yet his personality remained prickly and difficult to the end. His clumsy, formal, and completely unrewarded romantic pursuits of various local gentlewomen, including several wealthy widows who found his stern, pedantic demeanor very uninviting, it made him a subject of constant mocking neighborhood gossip in the county taverns. Also, his physical health experienced a rapid and catastrophic decline, despite him having been really the only one of his brothers who had quite good health throughout his life. And so in December of 1792, at the age of 52, Dr. Arthur Lee died alone inside the frame walls of Lansdowne, his passing largely unmourned by the nation he had spent his entire life to build. But it was mourned in Virginia, where he was remembered, or where it was remembered that, quote, "greater sacrifices of a personal nature were made by none in America for the promotion of her liberty and happiness," end quote. The ultimate irony of Arthur Lee's life is that he went to his grave convinced that he was a disgraced failure to some extent, a casualty of corrupt intrigue whose sacrifices had been entirely appreciated by the Republic. And indeed, in his life, they largely had been. And he spent his final years consumed by bitterness, hating Benjamin Franklin to his last breath, and viewing the rising commercial nature of the United States as something of a betrayal of the pure, virtuous republic he had envisioned. For nearly a century after his death, conventional histories largely endorsed the verdict of his contemporary detractors, casting Lee as a paranoid, deeply disruptive crank who nearly ruined American diplomacy through his groundless jealousies. But history justified him in the end. Late in the 19th century, the diplomatic archives of Great Britain and France were opened to international scholarship, culminating in the publication of the Stevens facsimiles. When historians examined these confidential wartime records and deciphered the coded dispatches and payment ledgers of the British Secret Service under King George III, they made a stunning discovery. Arthur Lee had been entirely correct. The archival records proved that Edward Bancroft, the revered secretary to the American legation, whom Franklin had defended with such certainty, had indeed been a highly paid British double agent throughout the entire war. Operating under the clandestine code name Edward Edwards, Bancroft had systematically copied pretty much every single secret American correspondence, from cargo manifests to treaties, and dispatched them from his position alongside Franklin to the British through a sealed bottle that was hidden within a hollow tree trunk in the Tuileries Gardens every Tuesday night to be collected by British couriers. And also there were his travels to London. The records also confirmed Lee's charges against Silas Deane, exposing a vast network of illicit private merchant accounts that manipulated public funding for personal enrichment. The very suspicion that had caused Arthur Lee to be cast out as a madman, this difficult fellow, was revealed to be a flawless reading of what was actually going on, which was rank betrayal of the Patriot cause and stinking corruption surrounding Franklin, Deane, and the others in the legation at Passy. The legacy of Arthur Lee thus remains a monument to the cost of public service and the sacrifices inflicted upon the best men of his generation, men like him, as they built our republic. Arthur Lee was a man whose profound patriotism and unquestionable honesty secured the tools required to birth the United States. As Potts notes, summarizing Lee's magnificent career, quote, Lee's contributions to the American Revolution should not be underestimated. Although certain of his goals were unfulfilled and his personal tactics proved defective, he played a major role during a formative period of American diplomacy. In the decade before the Declaration of Independence, as representative not only of a Virginia dynasty, but also of the American resistance movement, Lee performed critical tasks with remarkable industry. Through an outpouring of private correspondence and public pamphleteering, he broadcast a distinctive analysis of events in the British Empire. From Massachusetts to South Carolina and throughout radical circles in Britain, his writings spread the corrosive fears and evangelical millennialism that comprised the core of Anglo-American Whiggism. Critically situated at the center of opposition politics in England, close to both Wilkes and Shelburne, Lee provided his countrymen with an all-inclusive rendering of the machinations behind policies emanating from the Crown, the Ministry, or Parliament. These tracings of interest groups, disclosures of personal motives, connections of diverse events, and condemnations of incompetent administrators were broadcast by Lee to his network of friends and family in America, who in turn rebroadcast them throughout the American colonies. Arthur Lee was a key transmitter of the real Whig component of the ideology of the American Revolution. There was no more productive or more skillful polemicist, end quote. Yet his career was tragically consumed by the very suspicion that made him an effective guardian of his country's secrets. He personified the ultimate limitation of the classical Republican ideal, a purity so unyielding that it ran into the brick wall of corrupted human nature, even among great contemporaries. Thank you for listening. I hope you found this show interesting. Hope you learned something about Arthur Lee from it. I knew very little about him before researching for it, so I really found it interesting. Next time, we'll be covering his similarly aged brother, William Lee, who was also involved with him in Britain and involved in much of this diplomacy, so I think the two will pair quite well together. But I really just find the story of Arthur Lee fascinating. So make sure to share this episode around if you liked it. That is how we grow. Please make sure to like it, to like the show, to leave a comment, to subscribe. That's how we grow. It's how we keep this going. So I really appreciate it. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you again next time. Bye.